Hello and welcome to We Never Met, the podcast where I have interesting strangers on every single week. Today we're virtually meeting each other. If you want to introduce yourself real quick here.
Sure. My name is Justin Perkins from Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
And what do you say, what do people know you for? What would people know you most for?
Probably for mastering music. I used to do some recording and mixing back in the day, and for the last, I would say, 10 years now, I've been strictly mastering music. So, and the thing with mastering is it's a fairly fast-paced process, so I get to work with a lot of bands and artists. Over the course of a year, I do quite a lot of projects because it doesn't take as long as, say, recording and mixing.
Yeah, so what would you say, because you also have experience mixing and things like that, what's the time allotment from mixing compared to mastering? Is it a ton more time is taken?
I would say, yeah. I mean, I can comfortably master an album in one day. So you compare that to recording and mixing, you can spend days or weeks recording an album. Well, certainly days. Some people do it over the course of a few weeks. And then mixing, if you're talking about a typical pop rock song with a lot of instruments, if you can mix 2 to 3 songs a day, that's kind of cruising along. So when you compare that to being able to master a full album in a day without even really having to rush or that's a comfortable day is doing a whole album. So That's kind of the trade-off is the time thing. Of course, when I send it out, there can be revisions that take anywhere from a few minutes to half an hour to an hour, a few days later, but the bulk of the work is easily done in a day. And then with people doing singles and EPs more, I may do 2 EPs in a day or a bunch of singles. So I just get to interact with a lot more clients and bands and artists than a mixing and recording person would.
Yeah, and for people who don't really know much about mastering and the art of mastering and what you do when you master, what to you drew you to that specific part of music production in general?
Well, I think, the attention to detail that it requires and the fact that it was kind of an unknown. I mean, when I started getting interested in music, and even when I was doing recording and mixing, I didn't really know what mastering was. I'd heard the term, and I knew that it was the last part of the process, and it can be really important. But I think, I was curious about what it was and why it was so different. And it is a very detailed job. And I think, as I got older, I was just getting a little burned out on spending 10, 15-hour days back to back in the studio with a group of people. That can kind of wear you out mentally and in other ways as well. And the thing with when bands come in to record, it's like their fun go time. It's like their party time. They can go long periods of time, and some of them are happy to get away from their jobs or their kids or whatnot and just have a great time. And I totally understand that. But to be the person that's there every day, you can't sustain that every day. At least I couldn't. I couldn't do. I certainly did a lot of back-to-back 15-hour days, sometimes overnight and stuff like that. But as I got a little older, I just didn't want to be stuck doing that forever because, it's hard to run a business when you're, kind of locked into a recording session all day and people need your attention. The bass player wants to check out his bass part on this song and see if he made a mistake, and the keyboard player has an idea, and they can I'll go off and take their breaks and be like, okay, I'm going to go run down the street and get a bite to eat or take a little walk outside. But the recording person is just getting constantly bombarded with stuff unless you take and I would do this too. Okay, we're all taking a break. We're getting out of here, closing the door. But anyways, it was just, it can be really taxing on a person to just be at it. And there's some people that just mix now, and that's kind of nice for them because they can do it remotely, especially with the current situation we're all in. There's a lot of remote mixing happening. So that's kind of what drew me to mastering too, is I like the independent schedule of just working. Usually I work by myself, and I can kind of pick which projects I work on that day. I have to be sensitive to deadlines, but basically it allows me to take breaks and catch up on emails and take care of non-musical business stuff that needs to happen throughout the day.
Yeah.
And in turn, that gives my ears a break too, so I can rest my ears. And
Yeah.
so for me, it works really well. I just like the schedule and flow of it all.
Yeah. And so you talked about it a little bit there at the beginning. If you were going to describe like what mastering is to someone who didn't know, and you were like maybe even like pitching them why you should get your album or your music or your audio track mastered, what would you say to them?
Well, it's basically, the last step for any creative changes. And then it transitions into more of a quality control and technical job where it's making sure everything is formatted correctly and optimized, to sound as good as possible on all types of playback systems and all types of streaming services, vinyl, CD. There's a lot of things that you can optimize, and it's not like I have to do 5 different masters, but there's things to consider. But to really kind of simplify it, it's basically like framing the picture. The mixing and recording is like painting or drawing the picture, adding the colors and the elements that are what the end person is going to see. Mastering is not like framing it, where it's like, okay, we can trim some stuff off the edge here, and it's a little bit like color correction for video or for photography, where it's like, let's highlight this part of it, or let's reduce some brightness in this part of the picture. Maybe we can make this part of the picture more in focus, and this other part over here can be a little blurrier. So it's a lot like framing and color correction in Photoshop for audio, and it's basically working with just the stereo mix. So I can't necessarily turn the vocals up in mastering. I can't turn the snare drum up. I can't really add effects to the keyboards in mastering. All that stuff is happening in the mix process, where the mix engineer has access to each individual track. They have isolated keyboard track, isolated vocals, isolated backing vocals. When I get songs to master, it's just the stereo mix. So it's, in a real basic sense, it's what you can do kind of almost on your car stereo. You can turn the treble up, but that turns the high end up across everything. So it might improve the vocal sound, but it might make the drums and cymbals too bright. So you have to be very careful, because everything that you do, can affect other things in the song. So it's best if you love your mix and then you send it to mastering and then you love it more than you ever knew you could, rather than thinking of mastering as a fixing process. And there's starting to be some tools that allow a little bit more fixing than ever before, but you shouldn't send it to mastering to save it. I even tell my students at the school, like when we start the mastering program, I would much rather listen to a song that was mixed by a world-class mix engineer and not mastered than mixed by a very amateur or new person and was mastered by the best mastering person in the world, because they can only do so much with that mix. So mixing, I think, is more important to the overall sound, and then mastering is really that final, anywhere from 20 to 10. Sometimes, the best mixes need very little mastering, and the best, and sometimes stuff needs a little more. And then there's also the song-to-song interaction. If you have an album, maybe 3 songs have a little too much low end, so you use some EQ to make the low end fit better with the rest of the song. So it's also thinking about EPs and albums as a group, so it's a cohesive listening experience. So the listener's not tempted to adjust their playback level or their EQ from song to song, so everything sounds like a group. And that's a whole nother challenge. Sometimes it's easy if you get a band that goes to a studio for a few days, they record everything in one basically chunk, and it's all done by the same person. A lot of times what works for one song, for the most part, works for a lot of the songs. So it's, once you get one song dialed in, the rest come pretty quickly. But sometimes, artists work with this producer and that producer, and this one they did on their home setup by themselves. Yeah. So the mastering person's job is to tie all the songs together and say, how loud should it be, and are there songs that should be not as loud? If it's a soft ballad or an interlude, maybe that needs to sit a little lower in level. So yeah, it's just really kind of detailed stuff. I admit that it's not as fun as it's probably not as fun for most people as music production. Where you're coming up with lyrics and effects and layering stuff. I mean, I think that's what a lot of audio people gravitate towards too, because you're really building something, and mastering. You're taking a step back from all that and saying, how does this all working together?
Right.
And how is it going to sound on earbuds? How is it going to sound on a Bluetooth speaker?
Oh, sure.
How's it going to sound on a really nice, huge sound system, and anything in between?
I think you mentioned it a little bit before, but the amount of work you do a ton of different mastering projects and with a ton of different bands and artists. Like, is there a point where it's hard to, I guess, because you talked about, giving your ears a break and stepping away. Is it hard not to bring bias to projects, or like, you hear stuff so much over and over again, different projects, it's hard, like, get them confused and stuff. Is that a tough process?
It is, because, projects come in and out of here very quickly,
Right.
If a project goes smoothly, that means I've listened to it for about a day, and then I send it out and it gets approved usually on the first or second version. So I kind of like turbo listen to it for how long I'm working on it, and then I often don't get a chance to hear it until it's out in the world. And just because of the nature of time, I don't have time to listen to everything I've mastered for fun, for casual listening. So I try to, some of the notable projects, I try to, sometimes I'll listen to them, and honestly, sometimes when I do go back and listen to them, that's when I can start listening to the lyrics and really understanding, like, wow, this was a really good record.
Right.
When I was working on it, I was a little bit more in technician mode.
Sure.
Just making sure that it translates well and whatnot. And then, when it finally comes out on Apple Music or Tidal, I can just listen to it as a listener and one, not be tempted to adjust anything because it's already released, and two, I'm just listening to it while I'm doing stuff around the house. So yeah, it is kind of a challenge sometimes.
It is interesting to hear that, though, because when you're working on them, I guess, you wouldn't even think about the fact that sometimes you don't even like intake the lyrics because you're just like looking for certain things in songs. And
I'm very much listening to, frequencies and interaction. How's the bass drum interacting with the bass instrument? The lyrics are honestly pretty far down on the list of what I have time to absorb.
Sure.
Obviously, I'm aware of when the chorus hits and things like that, but it is a challenge to listen as a listener, and I wish there was more time for that. And
is there ever projects where you have to step away because you don't? I guess you've done so much. Are there ever projects that like stump you? Like, what should I do with this? Or or do you pretty much know based on the amount of volume that you've done so far? Yeah,
I'm pretty comfortable. And the other thing that goes back to your last question too is the way that you're able to make these decisions is, I'm listening in a really nice, well-treated room that's very, flat and accurate. So it's very easy for me to know if something has too much low end, or if it's too distorted, or if it has too much high end and things like that, where, a lot of home setups and even some mixing studios, their monitoring is not necessarily accurate. Maybe the engineer is used to it, but they're not always sure how it's going to translate out to the real world, if it does have too much bass, or if there's a problem they missed. And the cool thing with mastering is and the reason why I think I like to work so quickly is I only get one chance to hear it for the first time. So when I put that song on, I want to know right away, does it feel too muddy? Does it feel too bright? Does it feel too thin? These are things that the listener is going to catch on to right away. And once you start listening to it over and over, and even if something's not great, it can start to sound okay. And I think that's where mix engineers fall into a little bit of a trap, because if you've been mixing the same song for 5 hours and you're in a room, your brain's just going to start to accept what it sounds like and think that it's okay. And you may go down the wrong path, even though maybe in your room on that day it sounds okay. When you take it, the classic thing is the car test. Take it out to your car because you listen to a lot of music in your car. You may be surprised when you get to your car that it sounds way off. It's really boomy. So anyways, the mastering room is designed to just sound really flat and neutral and accurate. And again, I work quickly because I only get that one time to hear it for the first time. And I don't want to listen to it, the same song, for the entire day because it'll start to sound good to me as well. So
Yeah.
I'm kind of handing it off to the consumer world. So I want to know what people's first instincts are going to be.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You have so much knowledge, I think, because you've done so much in the music industry. I mean, we haven't even talked about you used to be a touring musician. And so going way, way back before you even got into mastering and mixing, what was your first musical experience like? Was it playing an instrument? Was it just purchasing a song that got you interested in the music industry? What was the first sort of, I guess, jump into music that you had?
Yeah, well, my dad was always into music when I was growing up, and he had a guitar around the house, but he was left-handed, so I couldn't really play it because I'm right-handed. But I could figure out a couple of basic chords upside down. But
Yeah.
I also didn't know that was upside down because that's all I knew. But eventually, in fifth grade, I had this teacher, and he was really into music, particularly like the Beatles and David Bowie. And every Friday, if you were a good student, you got to go in his classroom, and he would put the lyrics on the overhead projector, and the whole class would sing these songs. And just being able to get an up-close view of somebody playing the guitar, I was 5 to 10 feet away from him, watching his fingers and how a lot of the chords were the same, just different order and stuff like that. And that just really got me interested in wanting to play the guitar. At some point, my dad or my parents got me this really cheap little guitar. That was right-handed, that I could at least learn some chords, and it kind of grew from there. And then, I was at that age. I think I was in fifth grade when "Nevermind" by Nirvana came out, and that just hit me at the right time because prior to that, music was kind of ridiculous. Like coming out of the 80s, all those sounds were so unobtainable by the average fifth grader.
Yeah, sure.
Without, there's no computers back then.
Right.
It was like how, I listened to it. I remember one of the first cassettes I bought was INXS Kick. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yeah, I am.
That was the first time I remember going into a store and being like, I want this piece of music. I want to buy this with like my lawn mowing money or whatever. Anyways, but but as much as I loved that, the sounds were pretty exotic, I would say. A lot of synthesized stuff that I just it didn't even cross my mind to try to do. And I was a little young, but when Nevermind came out, it was just so pure and raw. Like, okay, I could identify that was a guitar and that was drums and this guy screaming. It's like, maybe we could do this, Obviously, they were an amazing band, but it opened up this door of being attainable. And then not long after that, Green Day hit, which was kind of similar, a little more positive, upbeat music, but same concept, drums, bass, guitar, really simple. And me and my friends, we just took that and ran with it, and we just learned how to do our own band. And
so what was that band? What was the first band you started?
Oh, well, the first one, it was called Amazing Larry, and we got that name from Pee-wee's Big Adventure.
That's a great name.
That movie. But it was just us trying to sound like Nirvana. We would do boombox recordings, and eventually we got to a point in high school where we made a CD. And I didn't actually record that CD, but I was doing I somehow took the reins of recording our demos and stuff in our drummer's basement, and eventually in my dad's basement. So I wasn't even like an electronics nerd or anything. I didn't, I knew some people that loved to take things apart and put them back together. I was not that person, but when the guy dropped off the recording unit, I guess I paid the most attention and was running the ship. And then when our friends' bands heard these recordings, they said, "Hey, can you do our recording? Can you record us?" And it's like, I guess I could. This wasn't really my intention. It just all kind of happened very naturally. There wasn't any one moment where I said, I'm going to do this. It was just a really slow progression of people asking me to record them. And that led me to working at an actual studio up in Green Bay, Wisconsin. I got out of my dad's basement and was recording in, what I would call a proper studio where bands were calling to come in and record their stuff.
Yeah. And so were you living in Green Bay at the time? Obviously you were working there.
No, well, I was born and raised in Neenah, Wisconsin, which is about 40 minutes south of Green Bay.
Sure. Yeah.
Just a few minutes south of Appleton. And so, no, I always drove up there. I never, Green Bay at the time didn't inspire me to move there.
Sure.
I would just drive up there, and sometimes I would stay overnight. There was a shower there and stuff like that. And this is, I remember having to go to the library to check my email and stuff.
Yeah.
It was before smartphones, and so I never moved to Green Bay. I just commuted and stayed overnight and things like that.
Well, so while you were working at that studio, were you also still in like pursuing music and bands and things like that?
Yeah, I was in a couple bands, and they were all very similar, to be honest with you.
Okay.
We changed drummers, a couple, different drummers, but it was always me and one other guy named Tim Schweiger, basically doing stuff. And so, I was still doing bands, but it became pretty apparent that I could more easily make a living recording bands than playing out. I don't think I gave it 100% on the touring and music side. We did our albums, and some people liked them, and one of the bands had a record deal on Lookout Records, which was Green Day's first record label before they took off. And
oh wow,
it's kind of a fairly well-known pop punk record label. So we thought that was kind of a milestone, and we did that for a little bit. I didn't love touring for a few reasons, but we could have tried harder, but nothing really happened there. But I was just getting a lot of calls to record other bands, and that was keeping me really busy. And eventually that was my full-time job.
Yeah.
I would have part-time jobs here and there to fill in the time in the early 2000s, but eventually those got in the way of the music. So I just said, hey, I think I can do this full-time.
Yeah. And you talked about it a little bit there. When did you decide to go, I guess, jump in full time into sort of recording, mixing, mastering, and that?
Probably it started to transition around the early 2000s, maybe 2004. And I was still playing in bands for a while after that, but I had to be a little more selective of how much time I spent away from the studio. And at some point it was like, I'm not going to just start a band just for fun. It was more like, this band that I really liked growing up as a kid needs a bass player, and I don't want to say no to that, because that would, it was kind of, at one point that would have been like an unheard of thing, and here I am getting the chance to do that. And luckily, those kind of things it wasn't necessarily full-time work. It was like long weekends here and there. It was a good balance, actually. So early 2000s, I just started taking it more seriously. I ended up moving to Madison, Wisconsin, to work at Smart Studios, which is interestingly where the guy that recorded and produced Nevermind, he owned it.
Oh, really?
But his name was Butch Vig, and they did Nevermind in L.A., but Nirvana had recorded at Smart Studios some demos and whatnot. So it has a lot of history. So I ended up working there for a few years. I was technically on staff, but it wasn't like a 40-hour-a-week gig. It was, you can bring in your own projects, and when we have an overflow of work, we're going to pass that on to you. There was another engineer that was there longer than me, or two of them really. So they would kind of get first call on like the projects, but if it got real busy, I was kind of the backup staff engineer, but also bringing in my own clients to record and work at Smart Studios. So that was, but I could also tell that, this is mid 2000s now, that, the music industry, some people consider that it crashed, kind of with the economy in 2008 or 9, because iTunes took over and just people weren't really buying music. So recording budgets went away. And I could see that people were really just coming in to maybe record the drums, and then they would take it home and do the rest, which is understandable. You could do pretty good recordings at home at that point. It was just hard to capture a full drum set in a home studio. So I could kind of see the writing on the wall that this studio is probably not going to be around forever, and I should think of something else to do.
And so what did you decide to transition to at that point?
Well, I didn't decide to transition to mastering, but I did decide to move to Milwaukee, which is where I still live.
Yep.
And, I linked up with a few studios here. I would rent out their space, I'd say, hey, can I rent your studio for a day or a few days? Odds and ends, still playing live music at this point when the situation was right. But eventually there was a mastering studio in town here called Mastermind. A guy named Trevor Sadler ran it. And about 2009, he called me, or I don't know what he did exactly. It might have been an email, but basically said he was moving to the East Coast. Didn't want to sell his building, and he knew that I was getting a little bit more into mastering, and said, hey, do you want to rent my studio? And it was kind of a perfect situation because he took all his equipment with him, obviously, but the room was already built out. It had good acoustic treatment. It was designed to be a mastering room or a really good mixing room. And that was a turning point for me for sure, because then I started to take mastering more seriously at that point. I invested in some equipment that's specific to mastering, and just being in that room, it was kind of like for some people, not everyone, I was like the new mastering guy now, because I was in the room where the mastering used to happen, and now I'm there, even though it was, so much of it is the person, it's not like, I'm trying to think of an example, but, it's the person doing the work that really is the value.
Right.
But it was nice to have sort of that baseline of being known as a mastering room. Yeah. And me attempting to do mastering full time. So that was a nice, a really nice situation to be in.
Right. Is there any highlights you have specifically that you think back to when you were like touring and playing in bands more that you really are proud of, or that you think back of and that you just really loved?
It's more of the whole concept overall. I mean, after I stopped being in bands that I was kind of creatively part of, writing the songs and singing lead vocals, there was a pretty active band in the 2000s called Blue Heels. I played with bass with them a lot. And at that point, it was nice to just jump into an existing project. The songs were written. I just had to play bass. I mean, it felt like vacation or something.
Yeah.
Like, all I have to do is play the bass, and that's it.
Yeah.
It's great. And then not long after that, this fairly well-known punk band called Screeching Weasel had reformed and needed a bass player, and almost anyone that plays bass has been in that band. But I did that for a few years. That was fun. That was great because there was a lot of fly-out shows. There was no loading of vans long drives. It was usually fly here. There was always like a rental bass amp already on stage. I just plug in, bring my bass, that kind of thing. That was a lot of fun. And those shows were usually sold out, 1,000 people or so. And with that band, they didn't tour much when they were most kind of in their prime. They were actually known for not touring. So a lot of people never thought they would get to see this band. And it was just fun to see people having one of the best nights of their life, singing along to all the words. Because, when I was in high school, I never thought I would see this band. I knew I liked their albums, but they just didn't tour. They didn't have to, I guess. I don't know. But anyways, so playing in that was fun. So it's more the overall thing.
Right.
After that, I played in a band called Bash and Pop, which is the bass player of one of my all-time favorite bands, The Replacements. After they broke up, it was basically a solo album, but he didn't want to call it his name, so he came up with the band name. It's actually one of my favorite sounding albums, and I like the song, so got a chance to work with him, and the next thing you know, I'm playing bass in that band. So that was fun, too. Again, playing songs that are just kind of ingrained in my brain. It was also, especially with Screeching Weasel, it was super easy to jump in because I knew all the songs just from listening to them. I didn't really have to practice much, just because I knew how the arrangements, a couple times you'd have to figure out like a tricky part here and there, but all the arrangements were really baked into my head as far as how the songs go. So that made it really easy and fun to jump into.
Yeah, that has to be an interesting experience, though, listening to these bands and being a fan of them and then entering them later in life. Like, what was your initial reaction to playing with them? Was it just, were you just trying to like nonchalantly, because I mean, you said you knew all these songs and you love these bands. I'm sure it was an interesting experience to actually play with them eventually.
Yeah, it's interesting to see kind of on the ground level how things operate and things like that. But honestly, I was just trying to take it all in and do my best work. So I didn't get too much time to analyze it. It was, I don't want to diminish it, but it was also a job, and it wasn't a hard job. It was an amazing job, but I was just trying to do my best, you know, and I was hired or picked or chosen because of my skill level, and I didn't want to do anything that was going to detract from that. Like if I got too excited about it and forgot how to play the song, well, that's embarrassing.
That'd be bad, yeah.
So you just gotta not think about it. It's not a time to try anything new or different. I just wanted to do what I knew how to do and not screw it up.
Yeah. And we talked about mastering a little bit, and you starting to do mastering at the Milwaukee studio. Was that something that you had to sort of, were you just so interested in it that you were like teaching yourself it?
It's one of those things where you're always learning, especially as things evolve, just little things like how streaming services adjust the levels now by default. When you install Spotify on your phone or computer, there's a setting that sets all the songs to the same level, and that's great for the listener. It confuses bands and artists about why is their song different than what they signed off on.
Yeah.
But anyway, going back, I just eased into it slowly because, again, we were in that period of time where music wasn't selling as much anymore. Streaming was taking over. iTunes was taking over. So I ended up on some of these smaller budget projects being the mastering person, and to some degree, I regret that on some projects because they were what I would call maybe higher level projects that I wish would have gotten mastered by a professional at the time instead of me mixing it and mastering it, because kind of what I talked about earlier, if you're in a not perfect or not ideal room, you can make mistakes.
Sure.
In mixing that you just don't catch in mastering because you're in the same room on the same set of speakers. Anyway, but there were projects where there just wasn't a budget for mastering, so I would be the, quote, mastering engineer. And to some degree, the mastering engineer is just the last person that touches it before it gets released.
Right.
But if you really are wanting it to sound best and translate well, you hire basically a specialist for that, which is the mastering engineer. And I just slowly eased into it. I would record, mix, and master albums, and then I would just start to get calls for mastering. People would say, hey, I saw, this is back when CDs still sold a little bit and there's actual physical copies, but they'd say, I saw your name and said you mastered this album. I like how it sounds. Can you master my album? And it was a little strange to get calls just for mastering because I was not selling myself as a mastering engineer. I was just a recording person, and I was kind of the mastering engineer kind of by proxy, I guess, just because no one else was going to do it. But as I got more of those calls, I took it more seriously, and then that coincided with Trevor asking me if I wanted to rent a space, and that was like perfect because I'm like, okay, yeah, I love a big, nice listening room, so I can make this transition, because it also doubled as a recording room. I was still recording and mixing a little bit, so I could still get that done, and it meant that I didn't have to rent out studios anymore. I figured I was doing enough work where I could justify having my own space, and then the ultimate goal was to transition to mastering full time, and luckily that worked.
Yeah, and we at the very beginning you mentioned this briefly, but you also teach audio mastering classes. How is the experience of like teaching, I guess, what you've learned over the course of the years that you've been in the music industry to new people and new people that want to be in it? Teaching, I've always liked to help people, but there's a difference between helping people and teaching a class. Yeah.
And partly that is because some students are a little lost. I was coming at it from an approach of myself where I remember staying up till I would fall asleep in my dad's basement trying to get things to sound right, and practice, just repetition, recording again and again and again, and would get a little better and a little better and learn what not to do. So I was approaching teaching from that angle of like, all these students are just as excited as I was.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And they're not, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Some of them they don't come to every class. Some of them have to get dropped because they've missed too many classes.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some really awesome students that I can tell that they're going to have some success. So I wasn't quite ready for that wide of a mixture of, there's like one person over here that I would probably hire as an assistant, and on the other end there's a person that I can't even get to send an email back to see if they still want to be in the class. So it's this huge range of, and everyone's has different scenarios, different home life, different, there's a lot of factors. And I'm understanding that. But when I first started, I thought it was going to be this a little bit of a utopia where everyone's just dying to learn. And it's just not that. But I do enjoy the process overall. I got really lucky to teach the mastering class. When I signed up, it was just teaching audio. And it was actually kind of a good thing because I had to learn how to be a teacher, and little things down to like where everything is in the classroom and where everything is in the school. So I taught some of the basic classes at first, and then the person that was teaching the mastering class happened to retire soon after. So I guess I was a bit of a natural choice because I do that for a living. Although I didn't demand that I did the mastering class. I don't know how it actually fell into place, but it just did. Well, I think it fell into place because when they first found out that the previous instructor couldn't do it, there was only about 2 or 3 weeks before the semester started. So it was a little bit of a panic, like, who's going to teach this class? So I kind of took it over, and I had to start from scratch. I didn't get any of his materials.
Oh, wow.
So that was a little bit of a challenge, but now it's up and running, and, well, it's actually not up and running because of the whole coronavirus. But the course itself is written out and in place, whereas the first few semesters were a lot of – I was going in very early to figure out what we were going to do that day.
Right.
And now it's a little bit where I can take a breath and evaluate what the course is and how to improve it. I have a nice baseline now.
Yeah, and being able to teach, has it made you sort of, I guess – look at your mastering on like a day-to-day level or audio techniques in a different way? Because I know sometimes kids come in with these like fresh ideas that you're like, I didn't really think about that. I got so locked into the way I was doing things.
Yeah, I can't think of any specific moments right now, but there have been some eye-opening moments about maybe I'm not doing it the best way. But it's also just interesting to see how people that are anywhere from 15 to 20 years younger than me. I'd say 10 to 20 years younger. Wait. Yeah. Wow. 10 to 20 years younger than me. I'm almost 40.
Yeah.
So they're probably in their, around 20. They're probably, anyways. It's interesting to see how they listen and value music and appreciate music, because we're in this period now where some of those students don't remember physical copies.
Right.
Not all of them. There's some that obviously still remember buying CDs and whatnot. But there's a portion of them that don't understand physical copies. And I try to explain to them, in the world of music, that's how you get more work, is someone hears something you did, they like it, they figure out who did it, and they email that, they get in touch with that person.
Right.
And it's really hard right now to figure out who's working on stuff. If you go to Apple Music and listen to a song, you don't know who engineered it. You don't know who produced it. Spotify has barely got a little bit of producer information. The streaming service Tidal has the best they have the avenue for the best information. They can only display what they have, but a lot of releases you can go on there and see who played bass and who played keyboards and who did backing vocals. So that's pretty cool. But we're in this period now where it's really hard to get credits for your work in the digital realm. Some bands are still doing vinyl, and that's cool. But for the most part, it's a different world now in terms of getting hired. And I'm trying to explain to the students that that's how I got to where I am now, is just my name being on backs of CDs and records. People say, oh, that person did it, and this sounds pretty good. Let's call them. Right. I don't know how. There's obviously social media now, but I don't I don't know exactly how that's being navigated with the younger engineers, or if it even is.
Right.
They'll figure out a way because they're smart, but I at least like to put that in their conscience, like, hey, you got to be mindful of credits. I mean, photographers are great at this. Usually when you see a photo online with an article, the photographer's listed.
Right.
The movie industry has the IMDb, which I'm sure actors have a beef with how accurate it is, but it's way better than what musicians and engineers have for their credits. So basically I try to stress the importance of credits, but also see how they, and it's not just my students, but other younger people I've interacted with, whether it's cousins, they're listening to music on YouTube on their smartphone speaker,
right?
Which just sounds you're only getting, that's not how the song could sound.
Right. Right.
It's like a really bad way. It's not very representative of the full spectrum of the sound. And
right.
It's just, but that's how some people consume their music. And it's like, wow, you just got to think about these things sometimes.
Right. And you also are a voting member for the Recording Academy, which I think is really cool. When did that come about? When did you get that voting ability?
Probably about 10 years ago. I was at an event at Radio Milwaukee. I think it was one of their award shows or something. And one of the guys from the Chicago chapter, and it's his job. That's his job, is outreach. So he was kind of being a salesperson about it, but basically, said, hey, we're trying to recruit younger people. At the time I was a younger person, and that are actually doing, that have credits that they can verify or validate or whatever, So at the time I had some credits on some major labels and some of the bigger independent labels, enough to get accepted.
Right.
And, I haven't done it in a while, but it was cool because I got to go to New York. Most of the voting happens just with ballots. So they just send you a ballot and you vote for your favorite artists. But I got invited to be on this engineer craft committee, they call it.
Oh, okay.
The concept was they wanted the best engineered album award to go to get voted on by actual engineers.
Right.
So they would fly like a small group of engineers that were part of the academy, to New York, or there's a couple around the country, but I went to New York, and we would spend a whole day listening to this stuff and you vote. And it probably could have been done remotely, but it was nice to get a fully paid trip to Manhattan. And spend a couple days there in a nice hotel, that kind of thing. And so I did that for a few years, but you can only do it 5 years in a row. So I had to take a couple years off. And
okay.
I actually got asked to come back this past fall, but I had an engagement that I couldn't cancel.
Oh, okay.
And I couldn't work. Even the earliest flight the day of wouldn't have got me to the meeting in time, and that's even kind of pushing it. So I just couldn't do it. But I'll probably go back to doing that. But there's honestly been some years where I've been too busy to vote for all the artists because it's a lot. It's a big, long ballot. And, but yeah, it's nice, and they do cool things. They do this thing called Music Cares, where if you have a medical issue or an addiction and you don't have insurance, as most musicians don't. Unfortunately, insurance in the U.S. is tied to your employer, and if you're in a band, that just doesn't really add up. So anyways, Music Cares is a great organization because you can qualify. I've known some close friends and people that have gotten help through Music Cares. So they do cool stuff like that, and they're really ramping things up now with coronavirus because so many musicians are out of work.
Right.
Because overall, it's a great organization to be a part of, and there's benefits to it for sure. Yeah. And like I said, I really like what they do with Music Cares because they have the resources and funds to help people in the music industry specifically. Yeah.
How many voting members are there? Do you know off the top of your head?
I honestly don't know.
Is it a lot?
I don't know. I mean, I would say it's definitely in the thousands.
Okay.
I don't know if it's in the 5-digit thousands or just 4-digit thousands.
Gotcha.
But I could also be way off. I don't even know where I would find such a number. But, because there's also, I think it's like $100 a year to be a member, and that goes to fund all their operations. So it's not
right.
you still pay a little bit of a fee, but you also have to qualify, and there's a couple other hurdles. But
yeah,
overall, it's a good thing. So I still maintain my membership.
Yeah. Yeah. And just sort of to wrap up here, where can people find out more about what you do and reach out and contact you if they do need something mastered or mixed?
I think probably the studio website is the best place. It's just mysteryroommastering.com. It has a pretty cool feature that my friend Marty built for me called, it's like a project calculator. So you can just type in how many songs you have, what formats you want to release it on, and some other details, and it gives you an exact cost right there. And
that's really cool.
That allows you also to submit all the details, because the other side of mastering is metadata, and I have to know the exact song titles and exactly how you want your artist name to appear. Is it the word "and" or is it the ampersand?
Right.
Does this song title have a thing in capitalization? All this stuff is important for metadata. So that allows you to submit all the information, and then there's a bunch of resources about preparing for mastering and what to do after mastering, and all sorts of stuff on that website.
Awesome.
So Mystery Room Mastering, and then there's links to all my social media. There's links to playlists on your favorite streaming service of stuff I've worked on. So
great.
In one click, you can just listen to that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me, and I appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me on. It's been a pleasure, and I'm glad we could connect.
Yeah.